All right, welcome everyone. I hope you're surviving the first few weeks of what I imagine is a pretty strange law school semester. And I'm grateful for all of you taking the time to join us today. As a brief introduction, I'm Molly Greene. I use she, her pronouns. I'm ACS's Associate Director of Chapters. I live in Los Angeles and I work with our students and lawyers on the West Coast and across the country. I also build out and oversee our class cancellation initiative and help manage our chapter's engagement with elections. I came to ACS with a background in voting rights and elections, and so promoting and facilitating civic service on and around Election Day is very dear to my heart, and I'm excited to have this discussion today. We are going to dive into an overview of and updates on canceling classes on Election Day, and importance of engaging students and other members of your law school community as poll workers, and other ways you can engage around voter suppression and advocacy. And I'm joined by two fantastic panelists, Justin Levitt and Nevasha Noble, today to have this conversation all together. Professor Levitt is a law professor and ACS faculty advisor at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, where he designed a program for students, faculty, and staff to sign up, get trained, and get placed as poll workers in LA County. He also served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice and as National Voter Protection Counsel in 2008, and has done a ton of writing and research on voting rights and election law. Nevasha is a regional field manager on the field and membership team at Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and she has been working with the Leadership Conference and our coalition, All Voting is Local, to build out trainings and a toolkit for And Still I Vote, which is AVL's new voter suppression and advocacy training. Before we get started talking about class cancellation and election engagement, I'm going to turn it over to Justin and Nevasha to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit more about how they've engaged in election work throughout their careers and in current roles, and share what they see as the greatest threat leading up to and the greatest needs leading up to November. So Justin, I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks very much, Molly. I really appreciate it. And I'm delighted to be taking part in this conversation. I was actually on the student board that was the inaugural board of the American Constitution Society at my law school. And so I have been in this from the very beginning, literally, and really, really happy to be joining you all today. I've worn a number of different hats, as you heard from Molly, throughout my career in voting. I've been doing this for a couple decades now. Have worked at nonprofits, have worked in federal government, have worked on political campaigns, have both represented and sued election officials of both major parties and of neither, and those whose partisan affiliation I just have no idea about, but have been trying to stay engaged in the fight for people to vote and to make that voting process as smooth as possible for anyone who's eligible for a long time. And part of the efforts we're going to talk about today are part and parcel of that. I'm now very proud to be a faculty member at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. We were, I think, the second campus in the country to do what we did, which we'll talk a little bit about. From my perch now, there's a whole nother way that I can encourage students to get involved and help students get involved at their own schools. And so I'm really delighted to be here with you all. I also, I'm part of the advisory board for All Voting is Local. And so I have a deep connection to both of the other organizations on this call and really love the work that they're doing. And so I want to turn it over to Nevasha to introduce herself and talk a little bit more about that wonderful work.
Thank you so much, Justin. Also, thank you to ACS for having me today to talk a little bit about the toolkit and the training that we have within Still I Vote and All Voting is Local. So as mentioned, I work for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and I'm a regional field manager. And so originally I was working on the education equity team, where I lead their field work in the states and in the local areas. And then I've kind of branched off to doing voting rights as well, because there's also just a need for that, especially once students turn 18, to be registered to vote and being able to vote furthermore. But then most importantly, to make sure that students can be advocates on their college campuses and things like that, to make sure that their fellow classmates are also registered to vote. And if they need any help, they can also do that as well. And so a big part of my background is really just advocacy and grassroots organizing. And so that's where I kind of come in with the voting suppression training and the toolkit. So I created the toolkit to kind of help students, advocates, anyone who really wants to be involved to be able to do so. So we want to give the training, but we also want to be able to give supplemental materials so that people can kind of go off and share with their networks, because this work isn't something that you just want to keep to yourself or within the trainings. Like most trainings, like, oh, what you learn here stays here. We don't want that to necessarily be the case. We want people to share it far and wide, because this is a very important election year, and we want to make sure that people have the tools to be able to do so. So I've been working very closely with a lot of our And Still I Vote team and all of Voting is Local teams to make sure that we're able to be all encompassing. And I think the most important piece also to our training is that there's something for everyone. So whether you like to be on digital and being on social media, there's something for you there, and that's mentioned in our toolkit, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But essentially, we've just been making sure that, especially on the regional field manager side, we just want to make sure that people have the tools that they need to be able to exercise their right to vote, because it is the language of American democracy, and it's very important. So a little bit about me.
Thanks, Nevasha. And I should say before I go on, because I didn't at the beginning, feel free to ask questions via the Q&A box. We'll take a look at them as they come in and try to get answered any questions you have. And this conversation today is really a resource for all of you to figure out how you can engage, figure out what kind of steps you can take now to create space for students to engage on election day. So don't be shy and feel free to use the Q&A box, and you can always follow up with us afterward. We'll share some follow-up information at the end of the call. So please do feel free to chime in with any questions. They can be kind of as broad as you want, or as specific to things that you've run into if you have already started working on this at your school. So we're going to start with a background, kind of a past, present, and future of the class cancellation initiative. Since especially the poll workers, students need to have class time off to be able to give a 16, 17-hour day to making sure a poll stays opens on time and stays open until it needs to. And even for other election engagement, a lot of time you need, a 5-hour chunk or so. So we're going to start with what you can do to create that space on campus, and then we'll pass it off to Justin to talk more about why poll workers are so important, why law students make such great poll workers, and what you can do to coordinate poll workers at your school. And then Nevasha will talk more about AVL's training and advocacy program, and especially about our Train the Trainers program that we're offering to ACS chapter leaders, so that you can spend time leading up to the election training other people on the importance of knowing how to identify voter suppression and how to advocate for just and fair elections on the ground. So to talk a little bit about class cancellation to start, for those of you who are not familiar with our initiative, like I said, I'm going to kind of go through a past, present, and future of what the initiative looks like. So in 2016, it started with our students at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, who wanted to get engaged in a larger conversation about the importance of being able to actually vote on election day, and led the charge to cancel classes at their school as a way to encourage students to engage in the election process and promote civic engagement on campus. And they set up a day of civic service on election day to be able to plug students and other law school community members into the program. In 2018, ACS continued encouraging chapters to do this and to advocate for class cancellation on their campuses. And several more schools joined the effort. Loyola Law School expanded on the program, and Justin specifically, by offering members of the law school community the opportunity to sign up, get trained, and get placed as a poll worker all through the school. And they were placed all throughout Los Angeles County and in historically underserved communities. And then following the election in 2018, we continued to push the efforts. Generally speaking, especially when approaching it from an administrative standpoint, it's a project that students start as far as 2 years out, since that's when administrative calendars get set on law schools. So immediately after November, we started reaching out to students, and we got feedback from students that they were interested in doing this for the next election cycle. And our students at Denver Sturm College of Law in particular really wanted to take what they were learning and put it into a guide for other students, which is something that we had on our ACS radar as well. So we collaborated and coordinated efforts to put together the Blueprint Guide to Canceling Classes on Election Day, which is available online, and we'll send the link around afterward. And it gives a bunch of useful tools and tips and timelines and templates and information about how to approach your law school administration, how to get your faculty on board, how to get other students on board, and how to set up days of civic service. So how to plug into opportunities and organizations that do voter protection work and poll working work wherever your law school community is. And we continued to build out our efforts. And now, since 2018, we've gone from a few schools working on class cancellation to 28 chapters interested and engaged, actively engaged in trying to get the initiative going on their campuses. 3 schools have canceled classes in 2020 this year, and Northwestern in 2019 officially canceled classes permanently and established Election Day as a day of civic service. And now in this virtual age, like I said, usually this is a program that gets done a couple years, a year and a half out to be able to work with administrative calendars. But because everything is virtual, or a lot of things are primarily virtual right now, we have sort of a new opportunity to advocate for canceling classes, or at least recording classes and excusing absences on Election Day. And so a lot of the Blueprint information will still be really useful in terms of connecting with your faculty advisor or other faculty on campus that might be able to guide you in how to approach your faculty, whether it's writing a proposal or giving a pitch at a faculty meeting, whether it's approaching faculty kind of specifically to gain momentum. So a lot of the same resources that are in the Blueprint, which does also kind of go through tiers the program can function at, are still really useful to advocate at your faculty level, where faculty are already recording classes on Zoom and attendance is already way more flexible than it traditionally is in a given law school year. It's a great time to be reaching out to your faculty and asking if they can either cancel classes or record their classes and excuse absences so that students can participate on Election Day. Some professors at schools have negotiated ways to give credit for civic service if students do a certain number of hours. So there's a lot of opportunity here to make space for students in a way that is traditionally much harder to get done when everybody's on campus and classes are set and everybody has only X amount of times to meet. And I think it's really worth reaching out if this is something that you're interested in doing on your school this year. And from the outreach that we've gotten over the past couple months, we've been really excited by the number of students who are really interested in creating space and canceling classes or excusing absences on Election Day this year. And where faculty still might not commit, another option is to draft an advocacy letter similar to what we're seeing on social media right now, kind of templates for reaching out to elected officials. That's someplace where your chapter can add a lot of value by creating a template for individual students to reach out to their own professors so that they can kind of get signed permission on their own to be able to participate either as a poll worker or doing election protection, or poll monitoring or poll watching, whatever kind of form it takes in your community and in your area. Like I said, the Blueprint, all of the tips that are in the Blueprint are still going to be really helpful for sort of how to navigate this process and the kind of support that it will be helpful to show. And then the other amazing thing, and also terrifying thing, but in terms of mobilizing folks on your campus, an amazing thing about this year is that we're really looking at an election month. We're not looking at an election day. The consistent advice is vote as early as you can, figure out what's going to be the most efficient way to make sure your ballot gets returned and gets counted, whether that's mailing it in early or dropping it off at a vote center. And so any work done kind of throughout the next couple months in terms of educating folks on voter suppression, mobilizing folks to make a plan to vote, holding programming on voting rights law and election administration, underscoring the importance of good election administration to holding just and fair elections, sharing important dates and info about how to return your ballots, taking the kind of train other folks on being a voter advocate or just getting trained up on voter suppression and advocacy yourself are all really great things to be doing throughout the month. And that all leads us very nicely into kind of talking about what the future of this initiative looks like, because there's never a bad time to start working on this. It is, even if you start now and you don't get very far for 2020, holding a bunch of election programming, using the month to continue to make sure that people understand how to vote, especially during COVID times, especially during times of civil and racial injustice in this country, spending this time to show how much your community cares about voting will go very far in the future to building your case for why your school should cancel classes. And the great news is that elections are always happening, and ACS's class cancellation initiative is ongoing and evolving. I've had students express interest in advocating at a higher level or petitioning to the American Association of Law Schools. Folks want to tap into a wider movement to establish Election Day as a holiday. So there's a lot of room for this program to build and grow, no matter where you are at it. And it's never a bad time to get started. So with that said, and the bottom line is that I'm very much here to support anybody who's interested in this program. So you can always email me. I'll share my email at the end and we'll send follow-up emails around. But if this is something that you're interested in and you want to figure out, you can reach out to me and we can set up a time to chat and figure out what will work best at your school. And so assuming you make some headway in getting classes canceled or recording and excusing absences, then you're in a great position to help folks be poll workers or engage in elections in other ways. So at this point, I'll turn it back to you, Justin.
Sure. And what you'll hear from me will lift up a few things, more than a few things that Molly just said in slightly different contexts. But there's a lot that she said. Everything I said, I agree with. And there's an awful lot that I want to really drive home. So the need for people to work at the polls is not new. It is not a 2020 problem. It's something that a lot of people have been working on for a very long time. And like I said, I'm really proud that we were on the leading edge of this in law schools. All credit to Northwestern, as Molly said, was the first school to do this systematically. In 2018, Loyola decided we're canceling classes in 2018 and every even numbered year in order to make this happen consistently. Now you have the virtue of having ready proof that this is necessary because the entire world has come to realize it's necessary. But it's going to be necessary long beyond the pandemic. So people saw firsthand what happened, for example, in Wisconsin in the primaries this year, where Milwaukee had 185 polling places go down to 5, primarily because they didn't have enough poll workers. This wasn't necessarily, there were lots of problems in Milwaukee, but the biggest problem was people just didn't show up when they were expecting to show up. And you saw that problem in Milwaukee, and the media covered it rightly in Milwaukee, which turned out to be a disaster. But a week before the election, there were 100 small towns in Wisconsin that had 0 poll workers. And when you have 0 poll workers, you can't open the polling place. There's nobody there to take the ballot. So this is a problem that is an urban problem, but not just an urban problem. Wherever you are and wherever your law school is, you can help with this. And I think you'll find a really receptive audience in many of your faculty members and much of your administration. And I will reiterate Molly's desire to help. I am also available to help you motivate members of your own faculty or encourage them to do what we, and now, as Molly has said, dozens of other schools have done across the country. The reason is because service as a poll worker is not only community service. It is fundamentally lawyering skill community service. It's just not traditional litigation lawyering skill. And you'll hear from Nevasha in just a second, there's an awful lot of election protection and voter protection work out there that's not necessarily traditional litigation, that is most definitely furthered by lawyering skills. So being a poll worker, serving as an official at the polls, involves applying laws and regulations to real people in real time. And you are often the last decision maker that can really make a difference for them. Occasionally, poll workers make mistakes. Those are really hard to unwind. And so your ability to translate legal code to real life facts on the ground, you are a legal decision maker, and there are vanishingly few ways to do that in society. Occasionally you get to serve on a jury. Occasionally you get to vote on a ballot initiative. You may actually have gotten a chance to serve as a census taker. And a poll worker is the only other one. So doing this is actually legal practice on the ground in a way that really fills a community need. And that's part of why this should be such an easy sell for you with your administration. Now, as Molly said, canceling classes across the school takes a little bit of administrative prep, but capture the moment now while everybody else is focused on the problem to do what you can in 2020 and to set up what you can do for 2022 and 24 and beyond. Canceling classes across the board gives the space for law students to serve as poll workers, to engage in other ways to protect the vote and engage in other election protection efforts, nonpartisan nonprofits and the like. And it is more effective than just students deciding to take the day off or asking their faculty members to take the day off. But I want to emphasize, to the extent that the pandemic and remote learning has created flexible opportunities, exactly as Molly said, you may be able to replicate that in some ways on your campus in your school right now this year. That is, the remote instruction that many of us are giving or receiving creates some opportunities to free up that day and free up the pockets of time that you need to serve as a poll worker for the day. Another thing that we found really important to make the most out of this opportunity, it's still available even if you can't do this, but to make the most out of it, we connected with our local registrar. And independent of party, independent of affiliation, the registrars are dying for talented young individuals who actually have the energy to be there for the whole day and also understand a little bit about the law, or a lot about the law. The fact that you all are prime poll worker recruitment material makes most registrars extremely excited to get law students and other graduate students engaged. The fact that we connected with our registrar helped us set up a program where we didn't just feed students randomly into a pool of general poll workers throughout the county. We actually had a program, and we'll have it again this year, and we'll have it again in 2 years and in 4 years, where we assign groups of students to work together at the polls. That's only possible because we coordinated with our local registrar, but that means now that a bunch of Loyola students who know each other can be there together. And if you were out in LA voting in 2018, there was a pretty good chance that you were voting at a polling place where Loyola students were helping you out, not only individually, but in a group. And that was a really cool experience for the students, we heard repeatedly, as well as the voters, who saw a really powerful, empowered, very, very able cadre of poll workers helping them out. Because these were people who were motivated, these were people who understood what they were doing, and there were people who were fulfilling the ultimate lawyer job of counseling, of providing service, of problem solving right there on the ground at the polls. The other thing we were able to do is, because of all that, because this is in fact lawyering skills, even if you don't see it on TV, we're able to provide pro bono service for it. Loyola is one of many, many, many schools in the country that has a pro bono requirement to graduate. And we were able to count the training, poll worker training and poll worker service in partial fulfillment of that pro bono goal, which was, it was an extra reward. I don't think anybody was doing this for the pro bono service, but it was certainly an extra acknowledgement of the real work that law students were putting in. One final roster of things, and this also lifts up something Molly said, there are lots of ways to get involved. I'm focused on this in canceling classes in order to make the space for people to become poll workers, or in speaking to your own faculty members in order to free up the space for people to be poll workers. In part because the need is so tangible, and in part because that's some of the highest leverage. But there are plenty of opportunities that you can have, even if you're not able to free up the whole day, and before election day as well. So the poll worker program is the centerpiece of Loyola's voting program for November, but it is not the only part. We are encouraging students who don't want to or can't work the whole day at the polls to sign up with election protection organizations like the Nonpartisan Election Protection Coalition, to go work and volunteer for organizations like Nevasha's that she's going to tell you about in just a second, to do registration drives on campus, particularly when you're voting by mail, or when lots of people are voting by mail. voter registration is incredibly important. There are some things you can fix at the polls that you can't fix by mail. And so helping students who aren't going to go vote at the polls in person, make sure that they're registered accurately in the right place now is super important. We tied all of the election engagement up with, as Molly mentioned, programming on what's on the ballot, not just who's running for president, but ballot initiatives, state legislative races. We've got here in Los Angeles an incredibly important district attorney's race, and that sort of voting on local offices goes a long way to further the racial and social justice that ACS is about in so many other areas. A lot of people just don't know what the options are available on the ballot, and you can help them find out by putting on programming at your schools. And finally, making sure that people understand the absentee ballot process this year. You know, a lot of people in California, a lot of people have been voting absentee for a long time, but in other parts of the country, it's not necessarily true. And even when it's smooth, it can be unfamiliar. And so law students actually putting on programming, just helping people learn pretty quickly, but they need the initial learning, how to cast that ballot and make sure that it counts, how to apply if they're eligible, how to make sure they do it early. That sort of small little baby steps helps people, as Molly said, make a plan for voting. It doesn't have to be really in depth. It just has to be essentially the equivalent of deciding what you want for dinner before the waiter's at your table tapping on a pad. You can do it. And not only can you do it, you can lead others to do it. At your own schools, you can make sure that your entire community is not only registered, not only involved, but engaged and informed about how they're going to participate this fall. And no matter who they're voting for, that is tremendously important. Not only this year, but especially this year, given the disruptions in the normal way that the process works. So I second everything that Molly said in encouraging you to take whatever steps you can this year, for this year, but also to lay a foundation for the future, because this is something that law schools can and should do every time there's an election up and running.
Thanks, Justin. I'm going to turn it straight over to Nevasha and then probably come back to both of you with some follow-up questions and conversation. But before we get too into the weeds, I want everyone to hear about everything that AVL has going on and the Insta Vote trainings.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Justin. You both mentioned very important things, and the thing that I would definitely stress, and it's stressed in our training, is that there's different ways to act. And so we kind of wanted to go through this training. We wanted to go through like 4 goals. And those 4 goals were to understand the history of voter suppression and what voter suppression looks like today. Because although we have come a long way, so that is important to point out that at one point in time when it came down to voting, it was kind of only for educated people and it was only for white people as well. But then as time progressed, people of color were able to start voting, people who were of different languages were able to vote, women were able to vote. So we did make some strides, but in this voting suppression training, we also just wanted to also put out there that there's still work that needs to be done. And so we kind of set the foundation of our training with that history. So we go into a very long history because it's been going on for quite some time. As Justin mentioned, this is not new work. It's something that has been going on for quite some time. But right now it's just like everybody is now in alignment on it. And it's like we're now trying to act as a collective so that we can make sure that we're moving forward the way that we need to. So again, it's to set the foundation so that we can continue doing this work. So once we kind of talk about the history of voter suppression, we want to create a sense of urgency around voting in a time of COVID and heightened racial injustice. And that's very important to kind of highlight at this moment in time, because we know we're not just going through the voting problems, but we're also going through COVID, a huge pandemic, but then also racial injustice, which all impact voting in some way, shape, or form. And so we want to make sure that we're creating that sense of urgency so people can understand how important it is to get out there and vote, because these things are all impacted, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about immigration, all those things are tied to those things. So we have to make sure that people are understanding that this is a sense of urgency and we need to be able to vote now. And again, as Molly mentioned, this is not going to just be something that happens for a day, but it's something that's going to be taking place a couple of months before we even get to that point, because it's just very important and imperative at this moment in time. And so then the third goal that we have for this training is to gain an understanding around mechanisms to further voting rights. And so what are those mechanisms to kind of help people be pushed to want to vote, or even help people that need help voting? And so we kind of talk about that. And so then the fourth goal is how we can fight for voting rights with advocacy tactics. And there are a lot of advocacy tactics that we essentially go through in this training. And so we're able to cover these four goals by digging deeper, as I said, into the voter suppression history. But once we get into that, since we want people to be able to go out and educate other people, we really do focus on messaging. How can advocates talk about protecting voting rights for all Americans, especially marginalized groups? And so our communications team has done a lot of research where they have done a lot of qualitative research specifically on interviewing people on like what resonates the most with them when we're talking about voting. And so although the training is called like the voter suppression and advocacy training, when you're going out into the public to talk about those things, sometimes voter suppression, that word doesn't necessarily resonate with all people. So we kind of unpack that so that people can understand, like when you go into the general public, these are some of the things that resonate and rings bells to people and are like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Oh, I see the sense of urgency. So we kind of talk about that in a detailed account. And so that's important before we take any steps, because when we think about advocacy tactics online or anything like that, you still want to make sure that your messaging is clear and concise and making sure that it resonates with all people. And so then from there, when we talk, after we talk about that, we really start talking about like 10 actions that elected officials can take now to protect the vote during the pandemic. And so these are just 10 actions that we've been like pushing for and that other people can push for. And again, through the research and things, these are the ones that came to the top. However, there are definitely more things that we can be able to push for. And our ABLE team does a lot of that based on states. So we all know that states are different. And so when we give this training in specific states, we're able to do our research on that end to be able to give more actions that can be taken, because in some places, voter suppression is a real issue and it's like bigger in some areas than others. So we really want to make sure that we're highlighting that. And so then also we essentially, as mentioned by Justin and Molly, we talk about voter registration, right? So you want to make sure that you know where you can register to vote, how you can register to vote. And those things are like, seem so small, but they're very important advocacy tactics because some people just do not know. And so we kind of talk about being able to provide that voter registration information, whether it's online, whether you're out in your communities, whether it's like little postcards, whether it's just you all kind of like being creative. And I mean, creativity has been a huge thing when it comes to advocacy tactics now, given that we're not able to meet face to face all the time. So a lot of virtual rallies is a big thing, and people like, you want to get people hyped and feel like great about this situation, but then you're also educating them at the same time. And we've seen great responses to that. So we kind of talk about those different tactics that we can be able to use. And there's a lot of different things. So for the creative people out there that may like to draw, there's create-a-thon. So you're able to create GIFs and memes and all these different things to get people to vote, because again, we want to make sure that everybody has feels like they have a place in this fight for voting rights for all people. So we go through that, and in the train the trainer model, which is what Molly was talking about, we really go through these different types of tactics so that you can be able to really go out there and push forward those tactics, but then also share them with other people, just in case you have other groups that you might have in your network that may want to do it. It's like, here, you can be able to take it. And so we really break down each thing and how you can make sure you're engaging people, how you can make sure people feel comfortable, because again, we are communicating with people from different backgrounds and people who have like different understandings. And so what this training also is doing is just making sure that we're able to relate to many people, and that's what advocates have to do, right? And Justin was definitely talking about that, because it's just like, there's going to be different people who may come up to you and ask questions if you're a poll worker. And so you just have to know how to message that. You have to make sure that you're meeting their needs and things like that. So we definitely talk about that. And then we also do talk about poll workers, because there is a shortage of those, especially since there's usually older people who are usually poll workers. And given the time that we're in, especially the pandemic, they're not able to do so. So we're definitely pushing for poll workers, because it's really important, especially if you're healthy and if you're able and if you're willing. Those are the things that we want to say, because we don't want to necessarily force anybody to do anything that they don't want to do during the pandemic. But we want to make sure that people do know that poll workers are in a shortage right now. And if you do feel comfortable being able to do that and you're healthy and you can do those things, we want to make sure that we're pushing for that. So in this training, we also go through the different things that you can do to become a poll worker. And so then there's a lot of information in this, so I'm almost done. But for the people who also may like to write, there's op-eds that you can write to kind of like get people to understand what's going on and shed light on this or educate people. You can also do letters to the editors. And so we also talk about that in the training. And then in our toolkit, we actually offer some templates that you all can use in an example, so that if you wanted to write some in your like local newspapers and things like that, you're able to do that. And so that's important because people automatically assume when you're doing like a letter to the editor, you have to do it to like really big newspapers. And that's not necessarily the case. You can definitely do it to smaller local newspapers, which sometimes gets a little bit more hits because people are reading those a lot more. So we kind of get into that information as well in our training, just so people can understand that there's lots of different ways for you to get involved. And so then after that, we essentially just share additional information at the end of it. So different types of organizations that you can also go to. So if you're in a certain state and you want more information, here's the website that you can go to get that information. Here are the hotlines that you can call to get more information. And then again, going one more time back to social medias, that we've also created a library of clickable GIFs that people can put on their Facebook links or in their Twitters, so that they can be able to grab people's attention, because sometimes people might not read the whole post, but they see these graphics and they're like, oh, these are great. And so it has very important educational tips on those graphics. So we share those in our social media toolkits. So those are essentially all the things that we talk about in this training, because we want to be able to not just educate, but really give you all things to be able to go forth and conquer. Because as mentioned, like, we are all in this together and we all can make a difference, whether it's in the ways of digital social media, whether it's just you talking to people and just getting more people on board, if you're throwing virtual rallies, whatever it may be, we all have a hand at this. And so that's essentially what this training was created to do, to make sure that everybody had those resources and information they needed to be able to do so.
Thanks, Nevasha. So like I said, I have some follow-up questions lined up because I'm in the fortunate position of hearing questions that students have all the time via email. So I have a couple questions to ask each of you, and then we'll hopefully hear from some folks. Our leaders tend to be both students and lawyers, actually tend to be very shy asking questions on these calls. So please don't hesitate if you do have questions. But in the meantime, especially for you, so this one's for you, Justin. Do you have recommendations for students on how to reach out to their registrar, recorder, county clerk, whoever it is that administers elections? Is it best to connect with a faculty member who might have a connection to that person? Is there a way to kind of get past the cold outreach? For students who do want to kind of go full throttle and try to set up a program, how do they get in contact with the people they need to?
Yeah, and by the way, just in light of spurring further questions, I'm not going to call on you in this particular enterprise, but Molly has made no such promise. So honestly, the best way to reach out is to reach out, right? Trying to figure out the best way to reach out to a local registrar is sometimes its own paralysis and its own barrier. And so I just encourage you, it's better if 20 students from the same school don't all reach out on the same day. But if you have an ACS chapter, you know the chapter wants to reach out, just do it, really. Do it soon, because election officials are already busy and they're only going to get busier. This is the crunch time. And so to the extent you're asking them for a sliver of their time, be respectful of that, but do it now is better than next week is better than the week after, for sure. If you happen to have a faculty member who's at your school who knows local government or who is engaged civically or who happens to know the election registrar, right? That person has a different title in every state. It's driven locally, so it's going to be sometimes the county recorder or the county clerk or a county judge or a town clerk in New England, in the upper Midwest. If you happen to have somebody on your faculty who you think might know them, that sometimes can be even more effective. That way it's not a cold outreach, but you don't have to wait for that. It is often the case that professors, that faculty members love hearing from students just randomly cold. It doesn't happen enough. And students feel like there's a barrier there to contacting us, whereas we really want to hear from you about what you want. The same is actually true with registrars, particularly when you're asking them, how can we help you? And not yelling at them for something they've already done that you don't like. So I promise you that cold outreach may seem weird, but it's not. It's definitely not weird from the registrar's point of view. The only thing I'd say is just make sure 100 of you aren't doing it all at the same time. But if there's one of you from your school that wants to be the lead, go for it.
Great. And this is a question I think maybe for both of you, because Nevasha, I think this has come up in other calls before also, but I know a lot of students have expressed concerns about getting PPE and trying to figure out whether counties have PPE available. Do either of you have tips or resources for how students can go about getting that information about what's being provided for poll workers?
Go for it, Nevasha, if you've got ideas. Otherwise, I can
I only have a few, not many, but I would definitely say that you could definitely reach out to the different people at, like, as Justin just mentioned, the same exact people essentially, because they're usually in charge of those things because they have to make sure that the students are safe if they're going to go ahead and do it. So I think that's important. And then the other thing is that, and this is something that we talk about in the training as well, but it's also just making sure that elected officials are making sure that their states have those things at each polling site. So it's just not, because like, again, even though you're college students and you might not be necessarily being a poll worker specifically at your college campus, you might be doing it somewhere else, who knows, but you want to make sure that the state has that. And for the most part, they should have those things because it has been like written into policy to do it. So it's just a matter of just like holding them accountable essentially to make sure. And then I can't think of the website off the top of my head, but once I'm going to look it up and then I'll drop it in the chat box. But essentially, like if you do want to be a poll worker, you can sign up through them, and they also make sure that you have, well, you get paid to do it because it is technically a paid thing depending on how you're doing it. And then they're also making sure that people have the proper PPE equipment to be able to be poll workers. So once I find that, I will put that in the chat box.
Two real quick follow-ups to exactly what Nevasha said. So one of the entities that's doing a lot of work, including on campuses, specifically recruiting or getting people funneled to their local registrars, is called Power the Polls, powerthepolls.org. It's the big one nationwide. It's got LeBron behind it. It's got The Daily Show behind it. It's got the Fair Election Center nonprofit behind it. It's got a bunch of different companies behind it. Hopefully it has you behind it and getting involved with it. That's the way to get linked up. Another thing is to keep in mind, and this goes to exactly what Nevasha said, sometimes you hear a lot about really contentious issues and people suppressing the vote, particularly at a state level. This is not true all over the place, most county administrators, most town administrators really want the election to work smoothly. Sometimes state-based bodies will get in their way, sometimes they'll help, but most folks in the county level or on the town level really want the election to work smoothly. My condolences if you're in one of those places where that's not true. But what that means is they got to take care of their own people. Remember, working as a poll worker is becoming an official for the town or becoming an official for the county for the day. And they want to take care of their own people too. Often their websites, not universally across the board, but often their websites will have more information about how to be a poll worker that will also give information about the ways that they're keeping not only poll workers, but voters safe. An awful lot of counties will have PPE available for voters who don't have their own, or will have specific cleaning procedures. The CDC now has guidance about what it takes to run a polling place more safely. So that's available and most counties are following that. So check out your local county website to see what information they've got about serving as a poll worker and the sorts of PPE they make available. And if you don't find anything there, then do exactly what Nevasha said, just reach out.
And I will add that ACS is actually partnering with Power the Polls, and we have a unique registration link. So we'll send that out in follow up to this call, but you can sign up and directly through ACS, through an ACS specific link. So it'll also track our ACS engagement with Power the Polls and how many folks we get looped in. And then Nevasha is exactly right that they're also doing work to make sure that PPE are being provided where counties might not be providing it, or just working with the county to make sure the county is providing it. And I'll chime in really quickly just to kind of underscore that point that Nevasha made, that that's one of the very many things that you can be doing leading up to the election is checking in and seeing what your county is doing and making sure that there's a plan for having safe and fair elections, and then making sure that everybody knows that information and knows what they need to do. So really, start now. And if you need more ideas about ways that you can engage in the months leading up, definitely always reach out. Nevasha, I want to follow up with you with one question also before we get to the end of our conversation, since you did such an amazing job of underscoring the importance of organizing and mobilizing, and you have some of that experience yourself. Do you have any tips for students on kind of how do they bring this to their communities? What do they do? How do they approach getting other people involved? A lot of our chapter leaders are leaders of their ACS organizations, but then also of other community organizations. They're actively involved on campus. They're actively involved in their greater law school and surrounding communities. So for all of the kind of budding organizers and mobilizers that make up our student chapter leaders, what are some tips for them to kind of how to lead others in doing this?
So I think that's a really great question. And so what I would say first and foremost, and I know I kind of mentioned this when I was presenting, was the power of social media. I think that that's extremely important because, I mean, people of all ages, all different backgrounds are all on social media in some way, shape, or form, some Facebook, some Instagram, so many different things out there. But that is one way to really just first and foremost, to educate people. But when you start thinking about social media, even things on the news, sometimes you don't always have all the right facts or all the right information because there is misinformation out there. And so social media is one way to really debunk those myths and put the right information out into the right people's hands. So I would definitely say that's one way, and it's an easy lift because it's just on your computer to do that. But then the other thing is, I would really just say, again, if you do have other networks at other organizations and things like that, I would definitely see how you can team up with them to again, the virtual rallies is a really good example of kind of getting people involved. So if you're working with other organizations, they have a deep connection, you have a deep network, you have all these people that you can actually bring together. And people really like those things because it's not even just you educating people, but some people have DJs on the virtual rallies. Some people kind of do little raffles virtually because there's so many different technologies out there and so many different platforms that you can use to do those things. So that's one way to do it. So you're getting everybody hype about the information that you're about to share. And I know some people also have special guests that they sometimes have on these virtual rallies. So I think that's a great way to do so because you're just able to get a lot of people together. And then another thing that I would definitely say it's just also text messaging is a big thing. And again, depending on what organizations you're close to, they might already have this platform, but you have Hustle and other texting platforms or phone banking resources and platforms that can be used. And they're very easy to use once you have access to them. But it's a great way to just educate people again, where it's just hey, did you sign up to vote? And it's no, here's the steps that you can do so, or any of those things, whatever call to action you want to bring. Because again, it doesn't even have to be a specific policy change that you want, but it's because again, our training is C3, but it's just a matter of being able to push for, just make sure if you want to be a poll worker, make sure that they have this or make sure you have that. And it's a great way to get through to a lot of people. And so those are the three big ways that we've seen people really making an impact, especially during this time. Because again, since we can't go into the communities, because some people would normally do that, have block parties, sometimes they would have real rallies there, but since we're not able to do that now, you just have to kind of think outside the box. And so you're able to do those things. And again, create-a-thons are something new to me. I never knew what they were, but I actually participated in one, and I'm not the most creative person. But I was able to kind of make my own meme about voting, and it was kind of cool. I also did it for census. So there's definitely things that can be done. And so if you join the Train the Trainer, we'll be able to go through those different things, but there's a lot of things that people can do. And those are the main ones that have really showed the most impact thus far.
And by the way, there's real science behind every single thing that Nevasha just said.
Mm-hmm.
So the people have done studies, and the most effective way to counter disinformation is just to relentlessly get the right information out there. Just tell people what the actual facts are. That's the single best defense against somebody monkeying with the process. The single best way to encourage people to vote and to drive turnout up is contact. And in that contact from somebody you know personally. So you guys, everybody listening to this and all of the members of ACS chapters all over the place listening to this, you have far more power than you know in driving people out, getting them informed, getting them engaged about the elections. All it takes is reaching out, exactly as Nevasha said. And that comes with real percentages on it. You can see the difference.
I agree with everything said. And I think that Nevasha made a really good point also, which is that when you bring people together, it makes something that a lot of folks want to do but are nervous about doing a lot easier. So especially if it's something like trying to set up a text bank and there are some free programs for being able to do this online. It actually is much easier than you think. But getting a group of people together to text bank for an hour, just reminding folks to get their ballots in on time, or getting a party together where everybody just fills out their ballot. You can't talk about who's voting for who or who should vote for what, but you can get together and all vote together on Zoom. Especially like Justin said, a lot of folks aren't used to voting by mail. They're not used to filling out a ballot at home and making sure that it's folded properly and sent in properly and has the right information on the outside. So getting folks together to do those things that hopefully everyone will vote no matter what, but things like text messaging or sending out emails to their friends and family reminding them that election day is coming up or that they should mail in their mail-in ballot makes it a lot easier to sit down and commit the time and get over the awkward phase of phone banking or cold calling people or whatever it may be. So really do use your ACS platforms as a hub for this work for the next couple months and for the years moving forward. You're in a great place to be the go-to organization on campus to be able to plug in and do election and voting work. And I think it's also, I will offer as a reminder, because I know that that all three of us are very deeply embedded in the election world and have been for quite some time. And I find that it can be easy to forget how little folks know a lot of the time. And so even on your own law school campus, outside of the people who are showing up to every voting event that your ACS chapter has, these conversations are not as common as you would think. And especially in places where you have law school populations with people who probably often came from places where it's not difficult to vote. It's a concept that's really foreign to people. And I think that this pandemic is making it clear to people that voting is often more complicated than going in and saying hi to your 5th grade teacher who's running your polling booth and casting your ballot and being on your way and having that take up like an hour of your day. So
this year, we hope your 5th grade teacher is saying hi to you.
Yes, exactly. So those are sort of my big takeaways. Like I've repeated throughout this, please feel free to reach out to me. We're all happy to be resources. Sign up for the And Still I Vote trainings. Either get trained up yourself if you feel like this is a new conversation for you, or since my job is to manage all of my chapters and empower my chapter leaders to be the best advocates that they can be, and all of our chapter leaders, I will really encourage you all to take the Train the Trainer training. I think going out and training your law school community, have it as an event, bring it to local classrooms and see if they're interested. Hold it with local bar associations or other affinity groups. Like, this is a way that you can add a lot of value to go out and train other members of your communities to be aware of voter suppression and advocating for just and fair elections. So those are my big takeaways. I'm going to pass it off to our wonderful panelists. Thank you both so much for joining. This conversation really, obviously, like I said, is very dear to me, and I could talk about it all day long. So I appreciate you both taking time out of your days. I know it's a busy time of year for everybody. So I'll pass it off to each of you for final remarks, and then this video is being recorded, so we will share it broadly after the recording. And in the meantime, please go out, get started with things on your own campuses and your own chapters, and let us know how we can support you. So Justin, final words.
So thank you again to ACS. A huge thank you to All Voting is Local and the Leadership Conference for all the work that Nevasha and her colleagues are doing. A thank you to all of you who are watching this. Hopefully you came away a little bit more inspired and a little bit more informed. There is a tremendous amount that you can do in the weeks and months ahead, and to capitalize on that energy to build a more sustainable program for years down the road. And nobody's going to do it if you don't. So get yourself fired up and go out there and do great things.
I would say the same thing. Thank you to ACS for having me to be able to talk about this voter suppression training. We're super excited about it. A lot of hard work went into it. But again, it's just very important information that needs to get out there because we need so many people to make sure that they're registered to vote, make sure they know where to go to vote. And again, we also just need poll workers to make sure that those votes are getting counted and so forth. So again, I just want to say thank you. And then lastly, please sign up for the trainings. It's really, really fun.
Yes, sign up for the trainings. We hope to see you all there. Enjoy your Tuesday afternoon. Stay safe, stay sane, everybody. And thank you for joining us today.